Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today we are talking about the life and the legacy of Hilary Teage, one of the most important figures in Liberia's early history. And to help us understand his story, I'm joined by Dr. Carl Patrick Burrowes, Liberia's leading historian. Dr. Burrowes has done a lot of research on Liberian history in general, and of course, he's written two books about Mr. Teage, and he will help us understand Hilary Teage's life and legacy. Dr. Burrowes, welcome.
Thank you, Octavius. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, so let's begin with a sort of an overview of why should an ordinary person in Liberia, those of us who might have read about Hilary Teage in our little history we did back then, why is Hilary Teage important? First of all, for Liberia and for Africa and for the world.
Yes. So in your introduction, I think you were a bit modest about Teage's importance. When you said that he was one of the most important figures in early Liberia, I would argue that he's one of the most important figures to emerge from Liberia, period, for all times. And his importance transcended Liberia. So why do I say that? Teage, according to his peers, was the architect of Liberia's independence. He conceived the idea and he promoted it over the course of many years. He had to persuade the public that this was a good idea, and he succeeded in doing it. He was an abolitionist, passionate abolitionist. And as a result, the Liberian Constitution forbade slavery. It also had some other articles in the Constitution of 1847 that were unprecedented at that time. There was an article protecting communal land holdings so that they will not be alienated. And as a result, communal lands continued, not all, but most continued to be protected up until the time of the war. People were driven away from the lands where their ancestors had lived into the cities or into other countries, into exile. And then the lands began to be greatly appropriated. So he was architect of the country's independence and deserves that status. And on the world stage, he was someone who helped to produce the second Black Republic in the world and the first in Africa. So now we fast forward from 1847 to the 1950s and 60s. And you have African countries emerging from their colonial experience. And one after the other, their leaders are saying Liberia was the lighthouse, the model, the example for us during that dark period of colonialism to say that we could be self-governing. Sekou Touré said it. Kwame Nkrumah said it. Mandela. So many of the early, let me add Nnamdi Azikiwe, first president of Nigeria. All of them paid respect to this entity that Teage had created. So look at the profound impact on the rest of the continent. And in the diaspora, there's so much evidence of how Liberia and Teage in particular influenced African Americans in their pursuit of, equal status.
The architect of Liberia's independence, of course, expansive impact, not just in Liberia, across the continent, and of course, across the world. That's a great summary, a synopsis of Mr. Teage. But let's go back to the beginning of the story. He was born in the United States. I believe Virginia it was. What do we know about Hilary Teage's childhood and upbringing in the United States of America?
So Teage was born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia in 1805. Around that time, enslaved blacks in the Americas were making great strides for their freedom. In 1800, the year 1800, there was a failed revolt organized in Richmond, not far from where Teage was born. And it was done by an enslaved African in Richmond. It failed. They were executed. Then in 1804, 1 year before he was born, the Haitian people, formerly enslaved, declared themselves free, independent, after defeating the mighty army of France. So this is the environment in which this man is born. On the one hand, encased in a system that allowed one human being to own another and to own that person's progeny for perpetuity. So, and then on the other hand, you have these efforts being made by the folks who were in that condition to free themselves. Cushland County, near Richmond, is where Teage was born. And it's coincidental, but interesting to note that Thomas Jefferson was also born in Cushland County.
I didn't know that.
And like Jefferson, Teage emerged to write the Declaration of Independence for his country. Coming from two different statuses, and both men played that role historically. Of course, people give credit to Jefferson and so on and so on. Where is Teage in the story when people play that role, being celebrated?
And we're going to come back at some point and look at some more details of that. But let's stay with that period now.
Yeah.
Racial discrimination and racism is pervasive. It is, in fact, law in the United States. How did that environment influence Hilary Teage thinking?
Yeah, so I want to contextualize a little bit more the personal circumstance of Hilary Teage.
Yes, please
and
do.
then open it up to the broader question you just asked. Hilary's father was enslaved on that plantation I mentioned, but he was a skilled leather worker and saddle maker. So he had a little bit more flexibility. So in 1807, the plantation was not doing that well. The growing of tobacco was somewhat being undermined by cotton. But in 1807, he was sold to two saddle makers in Richmond. The father was Colin Teage. While working there, the father now raises enough money to buy the freedom of his wife, Frances, and their two children. So now, what I was saying earlier about what people were doing on a collective level to emerge out of this system, here you have a family or a husband and father doing it on a personal level. You follow me? To secure freedom. Teage, Hilary, and his family, they face something actually worse than racial discrimination per se, because the system of slavery was brutal. It was beyond merely, oh, you can't go here, or you can't, attend this school, which was true. In Virginia, there were no schools for people of African descent, and they were discouraged from learning how to read and write. But in addition to that, there were these specific constraints that locked people in place, and not just one generation, but a generation after that, and so forth. And that marked his thinking in perpetuity. He was driven to overturn that system.
And so he's born into slavery, yes, and the father buys the freedom of his wife. What were some of the opportunities? Because if your father is wealthy enough to buy freedom of the wife, presumably there must have been some slightly different educational opportunities or opportunities in general available to that family. What were some of the opportunities, education and otherwise, that were available to Mr. Teage before he would come to Liberia?
Yeah, I want to just be really clear about the fact that there were individuals, many individuals in Virginia and in other parts of the U.S. who did what Teage's father did, but it wasn't based on the presence of, like we say, opportunity. You have to work overtime. You would do the work required by your employer or slave holder, and then in your spare time, ask permission to go and do this other job. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you do the extra job and you get a little something here and a little something there, you make sure that you're not using the funds frivolously, because you have a goal, you have a clear motivation for why you're putting in this extra effort. And that is emancipation of your loved ones. So it was under those conditions that your father did what he did. But moving to Richmond was critical. In a city, enslaved people had a little bit more room to move around and to connect with each other. The Teage family then joined the interracial First Baptist Church of Richmond. The Baptist denomination at the time was much more open to embracing people of African descent. They felt that the message of the gospel regarding freedom was not just for the soul, but also it applied to the body. And for that reason, the Baptists were shunned by some other denominations. So on the one hand, they're being shunned by the leaders of other denominations, but on the other hand, the Baptists are attracting enslaved people. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
Because that message is resonating with them. So the Teage family joined that church. The wife of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, he became Chief Justice later, also was in that church. And in the context of that church, one of the white members, William Crane, he was from New Jersey and he had moved south to open a business. And he organized a night school for some Black parishioners. And the Teage family attended, along with the family of Lock Carey, who, by all indication, was Colin Teage's best friend.
And that's a guy we need to do another program on, Lock Carey, I'm sure.
Indeed. I couldn't agree more. And so Hilary and his sister apparently attended that night school for about 4 years.
Okay. And so you talk about the church in which the church that they joined. I read the book, and there's a passage in there in which you state that Hilary Teage, of course, the young Hilary Teage and some other people form a church in Virginia. And I did a check of his age. I think he was born in 1805, somewhere there. And then by 1821, he was one of the founding members of this church. That would make him only 16 years old.
That's right.
What were some of the leadership qualities that made Teage to stand out at such a young age, found up a church with the elders and all of that? What were some of these qualities that made him to stand out?
That's a tough question, only because we don't have evidence regarding his qualities at that time in his life, right? We do know specifically what he accomplished at that point. We can go and look later in life and see the qualities of the man, and maybe we could argue that those qualities were present earlier. So later in life, of course, we see that this man was an institution builder. He edited, published a newspaper for, I think, about 20 years or so. He helped to forge this entity that we call Liberia successfully. It lasted for so many, years, centuries after, almost 2 centuries now, and so forth. He created churches in different settlements around Monrovia. He had many leadership qualities, but at that time of his life, as a teenager, what we do know is he was a boy, an adolescent, along with these adults signing on to say, we're creating this church for it to be implanted in Liberia. And then, from what I was able to find, when they went to Africa, they lived in Freetown for a while. And it is said that, why was it Freetown? He was a favorite conversation partner of the naval officers attached to the anti-slavery squadron. And I think that these men, many of whom would have been educated, the officers, must have recognized something in this boy, African, that they thought was worthy of them, debating and he was asking questions, I'm sure, and so forth. But those two things from that period in his life suggest to me that he was clearly set apart. What specifically set him apart, I don't have the evidence on.
And I'm sure I can just put myself back in that time now and imagine that education was not just going to school, interacting with the elders, like you said, whether it was the anti-slavery squadron in Sierra Leone or even the elders at that church in Old Virginia. Do you have any idea of some of the books and ideas and thinkers of that age, of that time, that most influenced Teage?
Yes. I made a point when I was writing to just sort of list the authors and the books that this man referred to. He read widely and constantly, and not just American authors. In one newspaper published November 7th, 1845, he cited a letter, he included, I should say, a letter from a correspondent in Haiti. You see the network that existed, along with excerpts from newspapers. One was a Republican-leaning newspaper in New York called the New York Tribune. The Evening Post, which was aligned with the Federalist Party, he had a piece from one of the articles in the paper. He also had an excerpt from the New York Sun, which was affiliated with the Democratic Party in the U.S. He included articles from Punch, which was an iconoclastic publication in Britain, along with excerpts from the Westminster Review, which was much more philosophical, and that was also from Britain. He would quote from Shakespeare, along with English poets like Alexander Pope, Edward Young, Percy Shelley, William Cowper, John Gay, and you could see the influence of some of their work on his. So he was not confined to say by reading American writers. He was reading broadly. He certainly did not like novels for some reason. He said that he dismissed them as frivolity and sickly sentimentalism. For him and his peers, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was their ultimate guide to understanding political economy. Lakiri, it was reported when he was working in a tobacco factory in Richmond, during his spare time, he would be reading The Wealth of Nations. An enslaved man.
Wow.
Yes. Along with Joseph Jenkins Roberts and John Rosworth, Teage was firmly convinced that Africa had played a preeminent role in world history. They were not even debating it. No, that was, they read the evidence and that was good enough for them. And the evidence for them would have been passages in the Bible, Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt for refuge with their baby, Jesus, Solomon and Black but Comely, etc., etc. Ethiopia shall, reach forth and all of that. But then they were also reading the most recent literature on ancient Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, as the archaeologists were discovering these remarkable constructions. So they were reading about Africa as much as they could find, and they were celebrating the role that Africa had played in history.
If you're just joining us, let me remind you quickly that today I'm having a conversation with Dr. Carl Patrick Burrowes, Liberia's leading historian on the man described as the architect of Liberia's independence. Dr. Burrowes has written 2 books on Mr. Hilary Teage. First is From Virginia's Slave to African Statesman, Hilary Teage, and of course this one, which is Black Christian Republicanism, the writings of Hilary Teage from 1805 to 1853. So, Dr. Burrowes, was Hilary Teage influenced more by American republicanism, Christianity, or Black abolitionist thought? And let's be careful now when we use that word republicanism. Let's draw the distinction between what it was then and what it is now, and then you can go on to answer the question about the influence American republicanism, Christianity, or Black abolitionist thought.
Yeah. I appreciate the fact that you said let's draw that distinction, because the two are no way alike. What now is regarded as republicanism and what existed, back then. In fact, I would say Teach was more influenced perhaps by French republicanism, the earlier form of republicanism. And I know that some of the delegates to the Liberian Constitutional Convention of 1847, including Samuel Benedict, the president of the convention, were reading the French authors of republicanism, like Montesquieu and others. So they went deep in that regard. And for them, it was about creating a society without an army. That was a tenet of republicanism, to ensure that the country, the society, is rooted in the will of the citizens. You relied on a militia for defense. And so if the community is attacked, then the men, right, would be expected to come forward to provide defense. And that meant that anything along those lines would be done at a very local level. So that was just one aspect of it. But it was about a commitment to sort of decentralize government It was about the importance of agriculture rather than relying completely on commerce. And you see the idea of that form of republicanism, it tied in with Adam Smith. The wealth of nations stem from agriculture and from trade. Let me just say this, Octavius, bear with me, right? People see the seal of Liberia. I'm not talking about the motto, but the seal. And I can't tell you how many times I've read the interpretation that this is about the ship bringing people from America
Yeah, the love of liberty
to come to
brothers.
the
Yeah.
coast. Yes. And it's all an assumption. No one can point to a place where, when the seal was created, they said, here's what we are doing. This is what it means. The reality is the seal is inspired by a medal that was issued. Almost, it looked like a coin to commemorate the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And this seal, it has at the center the ship, which represents global trade or trade between nations. And in the front of it is the palm tree, right? And the wheelbarrow and the hoe or shovel, which is agriculture. Mind you, the tree that they put in the center, on the medal for Adam Smith, it would have been wheat. Right.
Or in Liberia, we use the palm tree, which is a very, very diverse plant that can be used for so many different.
It reflects the fact that whoever came up with the idea, whichever group of people decided we'll put the palm tree, they understood the political economy of that place. The palm tree would get thatch for houses. The palm tree would get oil, and different palm tree, you could get palm wine. All of those.
You get palm kernel. Yeah.
So here we have the seal. It's been misunderstood. You could go, you'll see many seals in the U.S. Penn State University has a seal, the sea, ship, and agriculture. So that's the basis of the national seal. Now, like I was saying, republicanism has changed, but back then that was the interpretation of it. It's difficult to say which stream of thinking influencing most, Christianity, Black thought, or republicanism. Because by way of analogy, the foods that I have eaten most in my lifetime, I would say cassava leaf, jollof rice, and palm butter. But I couldn't tell you which one nourished me more. so Teage viewed republicanism as vital for freedom. As the Haitians had before him, they were Republicans, and the French, who were opposed to nobility, right? So that stream is running. His Christianity provided the basis for morality and ethics. But unlike the slaveholders in America, his Christianity found slavery to be anathema because his approach to Christianity was shaped by his culture, by his upbringing. And that's true for everybody. You know, the people who were Anglican in Virginia and they were at the top of the pyramid, the social pyramid, their culture also affected how they interpreted Anglicanism or Episcopalianism. So it wasn't just people of African descent who created what they call, for example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME. They specified. And for him, his Baptist tradition was shaped by his African worldview.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think that the streams of his worldview reinforce each other.
And we can see from that picture how important education was in shaping not just his worldview, but his future as well. Having an education, decent education is one thing, but it must be complemented or assisted by some habits, disciplines, etc., that would lead you or encourage you to lean on the path of success. What were some of the habits and disciplines that he had that contributed to his success, in your view?
You see, I think education was very important. It was essential. In fact, I would say it was indispensable. But you see, his education didn't come from schooling.
Mm-hmm. Very, very
because the
important.
schools in Virginia were not open to blacks during his youth. His education came mainly through self-study.
Mm.
And that takes discipline. But that was true for J.K. Roberts and many of their peers. These people were committed to freeing themselves collectively and individually from ignorance and so forth and so on, isolation, and being disparaged as you're not human or you can't achieve what other people have achieved. No, they were going to do it. Now, my humbling discovery when I was doing the research on Teage was this. I had earned my doctorate before I started the work. I'm collecting his letters and his papers and going through and transcribing them and typing. And the man's vocabulary was far beyond my understanding. And some of it was because it was archaic, right? People didn't use the words anymore. But some of it was just that he operated on a higher level. Let me be frank. So I ended up buying an unabridged Oxford dictionary. The kind when you go to the library, they would have it on a stand by itself.
Yeah.
I bought one so that when I'm in the night working on Mr. Teage and I see a word in his letter, I'll go to the dictionary and look at what does this mean. That's the level the man was operating on. Yeah.
And so earlier you mentioned that Teage was born in 1805, 1 year after Haiti is an independent country. Haiti becomes independent in 1804, and then Teage is born in 1805. So by the time Teage comes of age, Haiti is already a country. Why did he choose to go to Liberia instead of Haiti or anywhere else for that matter?
If I may, forgive me, but I feel like I omitted something about his education, commitment to it, that I would like to
Please
include.
feel free.
And
Yeah,
then
go right ahead.
I'll go to the immigration piece.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I lived in Liberia for an extended period, most around 8 years ago, I would hold Teach up to students. The students would say, young people would say, the post-war school system in Liberia failed them, didn't prepare them, right? They will get out with paper degrees, but they felt they weren't being employed. The people would regard them as not qualified. And sometimes it will almost come across as an excuse or, for me, hey, I'm a victim and stuff. And I recognize, yes, the weaknesses of the system, but I will also say to them, don't cheat yourself on that basis. You owe yourself the responsibility to pursue an education by any means. And I would say, look at this man, look at Mr. Teage. Look at all the writings he produced. And he was somebody who went to night school for 3 years.
Right.
So I think he's exemplary in that regard, and students need to be exposed to his work for all of those reasons. The skills that he brought to life contributed immensely to his success. Reading and critical thinking. And for all of us, I mean, you could have a PhD, whatever, master's, MBA. If you lack critical thinking, you're trapped by whatever the theory or analysis that is contained in a book or in the system curriculum that you're exposed to.
So let's come back to why did the Teage choose Liberia?
Thanks for reminding me. I think that the choice was collective and not just him as an individual, because his parents chose Liberia as well, or Africa. And his father's friend, like Carrie and Carrie's family, they all went as a collective. They went together. That's true, I should note, for most of the immigrants from the U.S. to Liberia. It was often a collective decision. Sometimes it was an entire congregation of a church. People would consult. They would think about doing this, so you wanted to go with us, and then they would do it. So I think that it was that collective choice of theirs. They went to Freetown. When that didn't work out, then they went to Liberia.
I struggle with this next question about whether I should ask it in the end or now. But I'm going to ask it right here anyway. So the condition of the immigrant, right? You are aware of this situation. I'm aware. Those of us who have left their country of birth, even if temporarily, to live in another country, you might, in some instances, experience a crisis of identity in terms of how to call yourself. Did Teage consider himself an American, an African, or something entirely new?
Teage, for most of his life, considered himself an African. And it wasn't just him. It was most of his peers. When I say most of his life, I mean all of his life prior to the Declaration of Liberia's independence. And then they started referring to themselves as Liberian. But before that, they were just Africans in general. So to give you a manifestation of this, when they were about to leave from the U.S., the families, right? Black Kyrie was approached by a Presbyterian minister and say, you're doing relatively well here in Richmond. You're a lay preacher in this Baptist church. You got a little job in this tobacco factory. Why would you go to Africa? And this is what Lycaris said. I'm an African, and in this country, however meritorious my conduct and respectable my character, I cannot receive the credit due. I wish to go to a country where I shall be estimated by my merits, not by my complexion, and I feel duty-bound to labor for my suffering race. There's a passage from Martin Luther King that echoes this sentiment. I don't know if you read Lycaria or not, but to be judged not by my complexion, right?
But not by the color of your skin, but the content of your character.
Content of my character.
Dr. King, yeah.
Yeah.
So Teage is
for
now...
most blacks in the early in the early 1800s did not see themselves as Americans. They couldn't, because the African Americans did not gain citizenship until 1868. That was 47 years after Teage left
How was
the U.S.
the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah.
Okay.
And 15 years after he died.
Mm.
So if he had been waiting, he and his peers, for citizenship, they would have died before it came.
So the question now is, even though they saw themselves, or he saw himself as African, but did his experiences in America continue to influence his politics in Liberia? I'm sure there must have been some instances in which, because having lived in the country, grew up here, some ideas must have influenced the way he looked at politics in Liberia.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's only human. We are all affected in those ways. But I would say the things he had experienced would be filtered through his lens. And that lens primarily was as an Africanist. He was constantly asking himself, what of this idea would be advantageous to, helpful to, or harmful to people of African descent? So he wouldn't just take everything from America and say, we need to bring it to Liberia. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
Even Christianity, you'd be critical of certain aspects if he felt that those aspects would be harmful to people of African descent.
So we pointed out earlier that he was a man of the cloth, a churchman.
Mm-hmm.
How important was the church? Of course, we've established that it was important in Teage's life. How important was the church in Liberia's early national development?
The church was as important then as the poorer society was in most of the neighboring communities. When I say neighboring, I mean Liberia, of course, for most of the the 1800s was very limited. It didn't even have clear borders. So when Liberia declared her independence, there were 13 towns that made up Liberia. Many of them were of repatriate or communities of people taken off of slave ships. But some of those towns were indigenous towns. So now the neighboring towns, communities and Bassa and so forth, had the poor. And the kind of influence that it exerted, I consider to be somewhat parallel. Let me give you some examples of how the church was important. If Liberians only knew their history, we would never have gone to war. And I don't mean know it intellectually, I mean know it with emotional resonance.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more.
Okay. Do you know the first school created in Liberia in 1823 was by the Providence Baptist Church, not the ACS, which has so many more resources. But the Providence Baptist Church people scraped their money together and they solicited funds from their friends in America to help them to form a school. And the school was exclusively for the children of indigenous rulers in the region. Not for the repatriate children. Because the idea was if the repatriate parents could read and write, they need to teach their children. But when the ACS agent was negotiating with the rulers in the Kipnis area for land, one of the things they promised was schooling. And like Kieran and others felt that promise needed to be fulfilled. So they created a school. Okay. Then the same Providence Baptist Church created a school for indigenous kids in Kitma. And at that time, there were no repatriates living in Kitma. But they were by leaders who invited them to say, "Oh, come, we need a school here." They opened a school. The inventor of the Vice script attended our school briefly before he invented the script. The school didn't remain open for long because of the slave trade at the time. Very devastating. And it ended up being closed. So the church played a crucial role, not just the Baptist church, but other churches as well, in providing the state that was created. I would argue was not just a political entity. It required the work of these different institutions, and schools like that were part of it.
So then presumably, is it fair to ask that Teage saw Christianity as essential to Liberia's national identity?
He did, certainly for himself. He was like unapologetically, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look, I invite your viewers to go and read the Liberian Declaration of Independence, please, because I think that was his masterpiece. And it reflected not just his thinking, but the thinking of his peers, because they approved it. There's no reference to Christianity in there. It speaks of God, but not in Christian terms. So no matter how anyone conceived of the divine, right, or that supreme creator, this was what they're referring to. They didn't say Jesus, even though they were believers. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that many Liberians will be shocked, because often, rather than reading critically or reading for ourselves, we get impressions that get superimposed on the past and the people who lived in the past.
So let's look at his legacy now. He was a founder of a church here in Virginia and the Providence Baptist Church in Liberia as well. Did he leave behind any important writings that we can, or sermons that we can look back and say, yes, this is the source that really made this guy tick?
I only found 2 sermons that were preached at funerals. They were like eulogies, if you will. But other than that, I have not found his other sermons. There were others, of course. This man would preach at the First Baptist Church in Monrovia on one Sunday, and then he had a circuit. And then the next Sunday, get in a canoe and go up the river to New Georgia. And for a while, that was his main church. New Georgia was a community of people taken off of slave ships, mainly. And then indigenous Africans from the region, who found refuge in those communities when they were escaping from kidnappers. And so those communities were most important to him. And he would go out of his way, out of Monrovia, and we're not talking about, Kenny in motor car, the old-fashioned means of transportation, to get there and preach. And you're not preaching in some kind of high, abstract language. Nobody will understand you. And he wrote about people who were converted in the community and so on. And so it was working, apparently, what he set out to do. But that was his legacy, I would say.
We've talked about Teage, the churchman. Let's talk about Teage in journalism. And before we do that, let's look at the environment for journalism in Liberia during Teage's era. I know he worked for and subsequently owned the Liberian Herald, but let's go to the beginning of that journalism career. What was it like? Was it difficult? Was it easy?
Again, I beg your indulgence because before we turn to journalism, there is something about his church legacy
Okay.
and broader legacy that I think needs to be touched on.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Teage was an advocate for education, but with a moral component. Again, when you say that in today's society, it invites skepticism. There's a sense that in a secular environment, we ought not even touch on anything relating to morality and ethics in the context. But in the African tradition, the spider stories that were told to children, you can look at it on the surface and think that, oh, this is entertainment, this is fun, ha ha ha, or that what's wrong with these people? They're teaching children about this character, and he is the antipathy of morality. But therein lies the sophistication that he was the central character, but he was not the hero of the story. You follow? He was the anti-hero. So people are holding Spider up to the children and saying, don't be like this man. Don't be like this character. He's selfish. He's greedy, right? And that's not acceptable in a communal situation. So avoid that kind of behavior. That's morality, ethics being imbued in children with entertainment. Okay. So Teage felt similarly about education. And in 1845, he was elected the first president of the Liberia Lyceum. This group was formed to give lectures on all subjects to the public. Their approach was, if you know, teach. You're in a society where illiteracy is high. You're trying to move into an environment where you're going to claim sovereignty. The citizens need to be prepared. So in his inaugural address, he said, the opinions which we have formed and the sentiments we entertain, whether derived from observation or imbibed from books, it is the object of this association to submit them to a rigid scrutiny and to close and searing examination, being assured that principles and doctrines that will not endure a proper test should at once be abandoned. That critical thinking again. Don't believe something just because they say so or because your mind and body and body really believe. Think about it. He later added that to persuade men to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God should be the end of all instructions. In concluding, he noted, quote, the education of a people should be an object of primary importance, as upon it depends a very great degree their own happiness and the stability of their institutions. Because if people are not educated, the institutions cannot endure.
Yeah, and I mean, democracy as a whole presumes on informed and educated public, right? But let's come back to the question I asked earlier about
Yes,
journalism and how
yes,
difficult was it for Teage
yes,
in Liberia
yes.
at that time.
Yeah, so as a former journalist, the question touched my heart, right? I paid close attention when I was in my research to the process, because I had no appreciation. I had no way I could have understood, what was going on back then. And every step in the process, in the life of a journalist, was extremely challenging. To write a letter or a story, Teage used porcupine quill. The porcupine sheds, they're kind of hard.
And for those living in the city, the porcupine is an animal that has like spike covering the body.
Quills. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
a quill is an old kind of pen that is almost like a long feather that people used to dip in ink and then write with.
And so in some places, people will take a feather, because the porcupine quill is similar to the kind of the bone of the feather, the base of the feather, right? And so there were those who would write with a quill taken from it's a feather. They would strip the feather from most of it. And the bottom part, the base of it, they have a hole there to hold a little bit of the ink so that it could write. But they're dipping ink, right, dipping ink, and right. But in Liberia, Teage used porcupine quill to write. Okay. So now, when it was time to compose a newspaper, oh, and by the way, I'll just add one other piece. So that the author writes a letter. Teage, the Secretary of State or Attorney General, he writes a letter. You need to make copies. We don't have a photocopy machine. You don't have a typewriter to make carbon copies. So that's where they would hire a private secretary and youth. At least this person had good penmanship. His job would be take the papier's original and make a faithful copy of it. So if Teage is writing a letter to the foreign minister of France, he needs a copy for the files of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Liberia. So that private secretary copy, they will keep in the office and then send the original. So these are some of the challenges in the process. But to compose a newspaper page for printing, they use letters, individual letters of the alphabet that were molded from lead, the metal lead. Right? The words would be assembled from those letters. So let's say you're spelling the word Liberia.
Mm-hmm.
You pick the letter L from the box and then you put it in the case. You pick the other letter I, you put it next to it, you take the B, you put it in. Then when you finish spelling Liberia, you take a blank piece of metal, you put it after Liberia, so there'll be space. You follow? Okay. Mind you, there's another part now. Here's the one that blows your mind. Those letters, the metal letters, they were reversed. Because it had to be the mirror opposite of what the reader would see. So that when you put the ink on the letters and you put the paper, what would come on the paper would be the opposite.
Wow.
Now, you putting those pieces of metal in the case, you have to make sure that you're not making typos, right? Misspelling these words. And I can tell you and your audience, I read those old newspapers back and forward. These people are discussing big ideas and world events, and there are very few typos in the paper. So that was one of the challenges, the process of assembling, the paper itself. But to add insult to injury,
If it wasn't hard enough already.
yeah, that people would take the paper and subscribe, or they say, okay, let me have a copy, I'll pay you next week. And then they refuse to pay. So Teage, he will plead in the paper repeatedly. There was a time when he stopped publishing again because they were not paying. But he used humor to ease the pain in a very sarcastic article he published in the Herald. He said he had sent this young man to collect money, and then came back and he was making his report. So the report told him, he said, Mr. U says he has no money, and you need not be afraid of the small amount that he owes you. Mr. V says he don't like the paper now because you are too polite. Mr. W says your paper is scurrilous. Mr. X says there's too much politics and too little religion. But Mr. Y says that there's too much religion and not enough politics. That's why he's not going to pay. Yes? And Mr. Z says, you have insulted his father's 10th cousin and he's not sending you any money. They say they will not take the paper anymore and they will pay you wherever they get money. So he's making fun, but at the same time, he's making fun of a pain point in his life.
So even back then, the work of a journalist, noble as it was and as it is now, it was still difficult financially.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So let's look at the body of Teage's work as a journalist now, a newspaper editor. He comes to the Herald. I believe he succeeds Rosram.
Yes.
So you talk about Rosram and then put Teage in the context of succeeding Rosram at that particular time at the Herald. And I believe he subsequently bought the Herald, right, from the ACS?
He did. Okay. Yes, he did. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So throughout the 1800s, the paper was founded in 1830 by John Rosworth. A little bit about Rosworth. Rosworth was one of the first 3 people of African descent to graduate from a college in the United States. He went to college in Maine. He quickly co-founded the first Black-owned newspaper in America before he came to Liberia.
Freedom's Journal, right? And while he was studying in college, he was reading the classics and focused more on Africa's role in history. And he was well known for having promoted whatever writings he found in the Freedom's Journal to say to people, look, you all are being told that Africa is nowhere, Africa is low on the pole scale, but no. The actual record says otherwise. So Rosworth comes to Liberia, he starts this Herald newspaper. Well, Teage is his assistant. Then when Rosworth leaves for Maryland County, or Maryland, Africa, as it's called, Teage now becomes the editor. And then he buys the Herald from the ACS. Okay. So Teage is editing the paper, and he hires this young man who immigrates to Liberia from the Caribbean to become his assistant. And that young man was Edward Wilmot Blyden. So if you look then at this newspaper record, the leadership, you have a chain of Pan-Africanists. Rosworth, and then Teage, and then Blyden. And there are others in between, but they're not that well known. Okay. And then Teage, he didn't just hire him as his assistant, but he mentored him and hired him as his personal secretary when he was at the State Department. For that reason, the Herald
it had a reach and had an impact with the radical ideas of Pan-Africanism and abolitionism that were in the paper, impact in Lagos, in Accra, in Freetown, and in the U.S. Mind you, I'm mentioning Lagos in particular, in Accra in particular, because I'm not trying to generalize, that it was reaching Kaduna in Nigeria or other parts, right? Or in Ghana today, Republic of Ghana. I don't have any evidence that it was reaching the northern territories.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know that in those coastal towns, the paper was there and was having an impact on people.
Wow. So the paper was not just a Liberian paper, it was across the...
And it was pushing these ideas,
Mm.
self-determination, African people are equal to anybody else. We can govern ourselves.
And I found a sample from the Liberian Herald, June 30, 1848. It reads, "We have lately had a large increase to our population by immigration from America. And if reports are to be credited, and we have no doubt that they are, a still larger accession may shortly be expected. Let them come. They cannot come too fast, provided they be of the right stamp. Men and women too, to be sure, of sense and perseverance, who have calculated on some difficulty and trial in settling a new country, who will not be dismayed by small things, who will suffer yet go forward. These are the immigrants we want. They may come as fast as they please. Liberia is large enough for them." A short piece, very descriptive, and your thoughts on that?
Hey, man, what can I say? The Oracle has spoken. Just brilliant summary. And it shows that Teage did not view immigration indiscriminately. He had, again, critical criteria. Let them come, but the ones who are coming, let them know that they need to be able to suffer in order to succeed.
Yeah, I like the fact that he didn't paint Liberia as some Shangri-La or La La Land, but there was certain dose of reality that was injected into the picture he painted. That
that's the nature of the man.
If you're willing to hustle, you're willing to suffer, but yet go forward, then come. So how revolutionary was Teage's journalism for Liberia and West Africa? Because you said earlier the paper went as far as the coastal towns in Ghana and Nigeria. How revolutionary was that idea of?
Yeah, I think that it clearly was. It had an impact. One can find that when you read what literature we have on, say, Freetown society, the intelligentsia in Freetown, especially people who were at Burrowes, and in Nigeria as well. In fact, there was a Liberian who immigrated to Nigeria. He and his family ended up living there. They preferred it. And he founded a newspaper in Lagos, based on experience from Liberia. But I think that Teage was really effective as a newspaper editor for three reasons.
I was going to ask you, what were the reasons that made him effective?
First, this man had a ferocious appetite for knowledge. And I'm not trying to flatter you, but in some ways, Mr. Teage reminds me of you. Because when they're talking soccer, you're there. We're talking chess, you're there. Economics, you're there. And that's how Teage was. He read political science, economics, history, scientific literature, literary works, poetry. He read. But the second thing, he was unselfish. So if he read things that he thought were of value, he would on a regular basis, try to simplify them and publish them for the benefit of other people. And then third, he was always filtering what he read through African eyes, always asking, how are these ideas helpful or harmful to people of African descent? Yeah.
So anybody can grab a pen and start to write something, right? But to be really effective as a writer, you have to have certain techniques, certain rhetorical styles. What were some of the techniques and styles that made Teage influential in his day?
I think even that little passage that you just read, your audience will probably get a feel, they may have gotten, from hearing it. You start to take note that this is not just somebody stringing words together. It's masterful, just a simple article, and it's like crafted. Teage employed an arsenal of rhetorical styles. he wrote inspiring poetry. He gave moving speeches, eulogies for people who had passed, for example. He offered insightful commentaries. So something's happening in the world and he's going to write about it, but he's breaking it down for the audience to understand what the implications are. Be mindful, those of you in this Liberia, here's what's happening out there and it's going to have an impact. He employed self-denigrating humor, making fun of himself. He laid out carefully constructed arguments to support whatever policy ideas that he was offering. It's like, we should do this, and here's why we should do it. And then he composed denunciations of slavery. And when you read the Declaration of Independence, you see so many of those styles coming together because he has to argue we should declare our independence, and here's why. But then the Declaration is poetic. It has so many passages, alliteration, etc. in there as well.
Here's something from the Declaration of Independence. He says on page 277 of your book, Black Christian Republicanism, the writings of Hilary Teage, 1805 to 1853. He writes, the people of the Republic of Liberia then are of right, and in fact, a free, sovereign, and independent state, possessed of all the rights, powers, and functions of government. In assuming the momentous responsibilities of the position they have taken, the people of this republic feel justified by the necessities of the case, and with this conviction, they throw themselves with confidence upon the candid consideration of the civilized world. Liberia is not the offspring of grasping ambition, nor the tool of avaricious speculation. No desire for territorial aggrandizement brought us to these shores, nor do we believe so sordid a motive entered into the high considerations of those who aided us in providing this asylum. Liberia is an asylum from the most grinding oppression.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah. Yeah. So you see, I'm glad you read that passage, and there's a part of it that I hear people often referencing without contextualizing, and that is his reference to the civilized world. He's talking about the powers of the time, right? So you're in a position of this nation that you're trying to launch, and as I said, only 13 towns made up Liberia at the time. So how do you move forward? He doesn't do it opportunistically by flattery without acknowledging oppression. He offers an analysis of the oppression first, but then it's bite and blow. So he said we're appealing to the civilized world. He's already condemned the oppression. But here's the thing. If the powers that be say these are the ingredients for a country to exist, any country that doesn't have these qualities doesn't need to be on the map. They should be erased. Then you have to step up and say, okay, we're holding you to your standards. We have those things and we should exist. One, we have a constitution. Is there a constitution is a prerequisite? We have one. So what are you going to say now? You say having, the skill of writing and a body of laws. We have that. And so a lot of people, contemporaries, are at a loss to understand why Liberia and Ethiopia survived when the European countries were colonizing other territories in Africa. And that's because both of them could say, we have constitution, we have a body of laws, and we have writing systems. If you say that's what it requires,
then we have it.
Yeah. So you're going to have to betray your claims, and then it's on you. But there's a passage in the Declaration I would like to also go back to.
Please.
And that's where the denunciation is taking place. Again, part of it is misunderstood by people. He said that we, the people of the Republic of Liberia, originally the inhabitants of the United States, that's a factual statement based on the percentage of the people who were part of Liberia at that time. Could he know the composition of Liberia 200 years later? Of course not. So he's speaking of what exists. But let me move on, because I just want to give you the rhythm of the language. He says, we, the people of the Republic of Liberia, originally the inhabitants of the United States of North America. In some parts of that country, we were debarred by law from all the rights and privileges of men. In other parts, public sentiment, more powerful than law, frowned us down. We were everywhere shut out from all civil offices. We were excluded from all participation in government. We were taxed without our consent. We were compelled to contribute to the resources of a country which gave us no protection. And he goes on. We, the rhythm, the alliteration, the poetry. And so you see the rhetorical...
And the cadence.
Yes, the cadence. So you see the rhetorical power of this man.
And that was from the Declaration of Independence, right? So are there other speeches that really capture his political philosophy?
I could cite the speeches, but I would prefer to cite a newspaper article, simply because some of the speeches, they can be quite abstract, as he's explaining. But this article in particular, it captures his philosophy, but it captures it with such power and resonance. He read a paper, a sample of this newspaper was sent to him from Philadelphia, and he read it, and he's offering a critical perspective on their view of abolition. And he says, every emotion of our soul, the last vestige of every principle, the shade of every idea within us is opposed to slavery. We regard with unmitigated and increasing hatred. We therefore hail the signs of its approaching downfall with an almost rapturous delight. The accursed system is tottering to its fall. Now he switches to alliteration again, Octavius. He says, all its aiders, abettors, and apologists, all its protecting powers in the New World, intellectual and brutal, cannot long sustain it against the advance of liberal and religious principles. The day of darkness has passed. The hosts are mustering for battle. God himself is in the midst. Whatever nation longer resists, however it may indulge in dreams of security and of power to oppress, will be found to be warring against the God of battles. Teage wrote this 19 years before slavery was abolished in the United States. He was dead when it happened. He had already said what he had to say. That's prophetic.
Yeah.
That's vision.
Very, very visionary, like you said. Earlier you said we've been able to portray that Teach comes from the United States. He's in Liberia. He's a man of God. He's a journalist. But in the settlement of Monrovia, surrounded by several villages and towns, right? And while they are attempting to establish a society, the church, government, so to speak, but the most significant institution in the villages and towns around the colony at the time, of course, is the Burrowes. How did Teage view the relationship between the repatriates and indigenous communities? How did he view it? What actions did he take to let me say this: is there any evidence regarding his interaction and his view of the communities that are surrounding the colony now?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's so much evidence, and I'm glad that you're asking. However, it's important to note that indigenous communities were not homogeneous by any stretch. So now, if you're going to understand, then your analysis needs to be sophisticated, right? That you have to come into this environment and to be able to discern that there are some commonalities and there are some differences. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
And at that moment, a critical defining element, one has to be able to make this judgment. Life depends on it. Would be, are the rulers of this community pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And this is a decision, a judgment that not only the repatriates have to make, it's a decision and a judgment that indigenous Liberians are making. Because people are fleeing from areas where they're being kidnapped and taking refuge in Monrovia. You understand? But that's just one of the elements. I'm not trying to make that as the only or the biggest, a part of it. Having made that judgment, who's who can you align with? Yes, Teage and his peers forged mutually beneficial relations with many of the rulers in the area, particularly those who were opposed to slavery. And there were rulers who they wanted relations with Monrovia because it would get goods imported from overseas, for example, but they were also engaged in trafficking Africans, indigenous Africans that were captured and selling. But it wouldn't pass them through Monrovia. They would pass them through Kidman or someplace else, or parts of Sierra Leone. And so, Liberians welcomed indigenous Liberians or Africans who would come into the community to escape slavery, or who forged connections that were beneficial for both sides.
So, to what extent did Teage and Liberia's early intellectual class, for lack of a better description, right, really understand indigenous political systems? Because this is the beginning of tension and subsequently conflict and ultimately war. I know that's an oversimplification, but let me go back to my original question. To what extent did Teage and Liberia's early intellectual class, upper class, understand indigenous political systems by which they were surrounded, clearly?
So let me give you, this is not the depth of understanding, but let's start on the surface first. I checked in the Liberian Herald when Teage was editor.
Mm-hmm.
Here are the names of some of the indigenous rulers that he interacted with, who he mentioned in stories that appeared there. Dongoli, Bay, Bage, Ba would be father in Baza, Dwawil, Famatori, Pa Koru, George King, Kopulu, Joe Harris, Bula, Jarafenge, Jenkins, Amara, Shaka, Mamaru, Prince Mana, Old Mama, a woman who was a ruler nearby Monrovia, Peter Softly. So this is not somebody who was sitting in isolation, right? And one of the articles that he wrote about Old Mama was based on a visit that he paid to her community. And when people would come to Monrovia to visit from outlying areas, he was constantly soliciting from them information about life, where they were coming from, what was happening. And people say, oh, the ruler for this area died, and now people are fighting over who will succeed here. And Teage will record that. So what you find is that the Herald is a source of a lot of information on indigenous societies that 20th century anthropologists used to write about what was life like among the Vai or, the Gola or whoever ethnic group at that time. They're using Teage's evidence to write those stories.
So I want to stay on the misunderstanding a little bit more. Would you say
But by the way, before you go there, I want to say this. I omitted to say this. I mentioned Bagay, but Teache's story about Bagay came about because Bagay was a Basa ruler who ended up in conflict with many of his peers.
Why?
I don't know the source of it, but I do know that from reading Teache's article, the others had condemned him, and his punishment was supposed to be capital. So he panicked and called upon the Liberian government to please intercede and negotiate. And this was happening often in the environment. So it's like you're a neutral player, come. And so Teage was shuttling between the others and Bagay to try and understand what was going on and to, mediate. And he's traveling by land, as we say, he was walking from Monrovia to the area which is now Buchanan, going up the river, St. John, to where Bagay was living, talk to him, come back to the other rulers and say, the man said so and so. So that's the level of understanding I think that he had, and I wanted to make it concrete. I didn't want to leave it just with name.
Okay. So let's go on to the misunderstanding now. Did our early repatriate people, did they understand indigenous governance structures? Do you think?
Yes. And this understanding that he had, and not just him but the others, came from intimate and personal relationships. I'll leave that one to sit for a minute. You see, if you take Salvoso, the ruler of Bopolo.
That's another guy we need to do a whole program on, just Saboso alone.
Okay. So here's a man who, from all indications, was Muslim. He sent his 3 sons, 3, to Monrovia to live with the McGill family, one of the wealthiest families at the time. They were involved in trading. His community depended on trading. So this is a commercial relationship too, right? Between him and the McGills. He sends his 3 sons to live with McGill to go to school. They lived there for years in Monrovia. They go to Bopolo, vacation time, come back. And the goal was let him learn how to read, let him understand English. He's a trader. He wants to get a sense of the global environment. And the children go back to Bopolo eventually. One of the sons succeeds as well. Nobody converted them to Christianity. Nobody forced them to do anything. None of them ever said, oh, I was in Monrovia, the people oppressing me. So the relationships were intimate in some cases and personal. Now, with Teage, from what I gather, speaking of intimate, from what I gather, Teage and his wife had no natural children. But at any time, they had up to 20 children in their home. Some of them were repatriated children that both parents died, and the children were orphaned. Some of them were children taken off of slave ships from the Congo, other parts of Africa, right? And they come, no adult relatives on the ship, just kids. And he takes them. Then when he's traveling in Liberia, or what is now Liberia, and he sees kids who have been kidnapped, he would negotiate to redeem them and bring them to the house to live with his family. A white girl who he had brought grew up in the family with him. And she ends up marrying one of his colleagues in the Baptist church, one of the pastors in the Baptist church. That man was Bassa. His name was Louis Crocker. So the name, the English name, throws people off. They think that he's a repatriate, right? So Teage is at the center of a union that takes place between a girl who's by ancestry and a pastor who's Bassa. And that man was the clan leader, right, for his clan in Bassa. Mind you, 3 of Teage's Baptist colleagues were Bassa. There were others who were indigenous. But there was a man named Jacob von Braun. He was converted to Christianity by Germans in Freetown. He ends up, in the Baptist Church. When the Southern Baptist Convention foreign missionary board wrote Teage to say, we need missionaries in Liberia, we'll pay salary. Teage wrote them and said, I suggest you don't hire any repatriates. Here are these 3 guys here. If you want them to do missionary work, they can reach people, they know the language and so on, get them the salary, let them do their job. Those are the kind of relationships that he had. It's not abstract, it was intimate.
And these more or less personal anecdotes could suffice, but here was a guy with a big platform. Did he, beyond the personal interactions with people, did he use the platform to advocate for inclusion, or should those personal anecdotes suffice?
I would say that Teage absolutely advocated for inclusion, but only of those who wanted it. And I think that is a really important, it's a subtle point, but I think it's really important. Because in many of our contemporary political science analysis, it seems as if the scholars they assume that everybody will want to be part of Liberia, right? Looking back, based on what Teage created, it's like, of course, people want to be a part of it. But the idea at the time that Teage had was people wanted to be, if they wanted it, of course, they ought to come. The 3 examples I gave you of Baptist pastors, not members, would be evidence of people who want this. Come, you're not a full member. If you are worthy or you're interested, you become a pastor. Let's look at Cuttington University, for example. The first principal of that institution was Valentine, who was Gribble, appointed by Bishop Samuel Ferguson. Ferguson could have said, I came from South Carolina. I will look for people who came from South Carolina who need, repatriates or my cousin or my child. No. The idea was you putting the most qualified people in those positions, indigenous or not, there we are. So he advocated for it, but it will be, if people want this, whosoever will let him come.
Okay.
And in the declaration, it's there. He says that we have been joined by the ascension of indigenous Africans.
I know the portrait we are successfully painting is Hilary Teage, architect of Liberia, churchman, journalist. But could he have done more to build unity among Liberia's diverse population at the time? And to what extent should he be held accountable for subsequent tensions in the society? Because here's a guy who basically knew quite a bit and did what he could, but can we throw more at him for not doing enough, in your estimation?
It is possible, theoretically, that he could have done more. But I hasten to say to you and to the viewers, isn't that true for all of us? If we are human, isn't that possible that no matter in what sphere of life, when we are gone, that it could be said that he or she could have done more? So I grant you that theoretical possibility based on the fact that he was human. But I think that measure can be used and has been used in a Liberian context to cut people down who do not deserve it because they accomplished so much. And then rather than acknowledging their accomplishment, their critics will say, well, they could have done more. So one of the folks who I would argue has pushed that rather successfully in the current context was the late political scientist Amos Sawyer and former interim president of Liberia. In a book he wrote called The Emergence of Autocracy in Liberia, he says this, that there was an incompatibility of purpose between indigenous Liberians and those who came. Incompatibility of purpose. Now, on what basis would one say that? Because this person is Kasao leader, I mean, it's something else? Or are there more fundamental questions at stake in this 19th century environment, such as the phenomena of the transatlantic slave trade? Is that not a basis where people's lives depend on making the right alliance to secure stability and freedom? But Sawyer sweeps all of that. And he's not a historian, so maybe there's no need for him to know the context at the time. But he's willing, not being a historian, to make statements emphatic about history. He goes on to say that besides this incompatibility of purpose, there was another problem with the idea of Liberia. The very idea. There were flaws in the implementation of the idea. A major flaw was the almost total lack of comprehension of the actual African situation into which the immigrants were to be sent. Even though there was a paucity of literature on West Africa at the time, there is not evidence that the ACS searched out and studied such limited information as was available or contemplated undertaking a thorough and systematic study. Let me say two things quickly. Both of those claims are false. There was more than a paucity of information about the Windward Coast. More. People had records going back from Pedro de Centra, coming all the way out, all the explorers who came. I have a book called Between the Cold Authorities and the Salty Sea, 400 pages. I went through those sources, right? I know what those sources were, what people knew about that area. And I'm not patting myself on the back because there's an anthropologist, Warren Dazajeo, who also reviewed that literature that existed. So Sawyer claims there was a paucity, but the reality is the literature was there. The second claim he makes is that the ACS didn't review the literature, and that's false. Now, he might not be familiar, right? And I'm not holding him to the standards of a historian to say he would be expected to know. But if you haven't read, then you shouldn't make emphatic claims, is what I'm saying. All right? But I want to go a little beyond that. Implied in Sawyer's criticism is the idea that before a nation is founded, there ought to be what he calls a thorough and comprehensive investigation of the literature. That's a very elitist and scholarly assumption. I don't know of any nation founded on that principle. It's like you work it out theoretically before it is launched. The societies in the New World that were founded by Europeans. They had less information on the Americas than the ACS had on the Windward Coast. But they launched those societies anyway.
But let me give you some pushback on that now, because
Please, I welcome it.
yeah, he may not have been an historian in the true sense of the word, but from a purely political perspective, you have to admit that that argument took foothold in Liberia, and in fact is considered to and agreed with by a lot of Liberians. In fact, an entire political movement was based on those two postulations.
Meaning?
That, in other words, those were the arguments that formed the basis for the modern progressive movement in Liberia, which became very successful at a certain point in time.
But, the fact
and that's
that
a political question as opposed to a historical question, I guess.
Yeah, no. But the point I was making, while it was rooted in historical analysis, was that the argument itself as a political science theory is flawed. And it presumes a kind of approach to the formation of nations that no other nation I know of has ever undertaken. So now we take this kind of a theoretical, unprecedented criteria and we apply it to Liberia. Liberia should have done something that nobody else in the history of the world had done. The UK didn't come into being because people did some kind of thorough, comprehensive evaluation of the country or the territories that became a part of it, or France, or the Denmark, or the United States. So you're holding Liberia up to something exclusive. And because the progressive movement might have been successful, doesn't prove that the basis of its argument were accurate. And furthermore, I would say, let's assume that its arguments were accurate for the time in which they lived, right? 1960s, 1970s, 1970s particularly. That's no basis, no reason for now projecting it backwards and say, oh, that's Teage's fault, or that's Fitzgerald's fault. Because the evidence overwhelmingly, in my mind, refutes it. These are human beings who forged a nation, right? And the nation existed without fratricidal civil war until the 1980s.
And I wasn't arguing about the veracity of the position that he takes in the book. I was making a statement that whether it was true or not, it was successful in terms of taking hold in Liberia and changing the course of the country. But let's come back to Hilary Teage. Do you think he and that position is sort of led to the confusion that's in the society today? Do you think Teage supported expanding political participation for indigenous Liberians? If so, what evidence do you have for that?
I said to you earlier that, yeah, the evidence was overwhelming in terms of his writings and, in terms of his life. It's one thing for people to write abstractly about, oh, I support this idea. But then when you look at their actual conduct, behavior, they're not implementing it. You understand me? And that's why I cited some of the details that I did. But Teage not only wrote about it, but he did it. He's recommending his indigenous peers for salaries over repatriates. He's elevating people, like indigenous Liberians, in different domains of the society and institutions and so on. Going by Keenan to preach to indigenous communities on the river and people who were taking off slave ships from the Congo, instead of sitting down in Monrovia in coat suit, and saying, I'm going to preach to people who came from Virginia like me.
Wait,
So I don't know what else we want for him to have done. I mean, this man put his life on the line. He lived what he taught, what he preached.
wake every tuneful string. Tell me about that, and how did Teage balance national unity with cultural diversity?
Yeah. As far as I can tell, from all of my research, not just on Teage, but beyond, Teage was the first person who wrote Liberian Pidgin, what we call Kolokwa,
Mm-hmm. Really?
in a public forum, in a newspaper. And not just once, several times, because he was constantly trying to capture how people spoke. And he also was interested in the readers understanding what he was saying. And so when he used Kolokwa in the paper, he wasn't poking fun at the speaker, which some contemporary Liberians, educated Liberians do. And he wasn't poking fun of the language and saying, oh, you see, this is substandard. This is how we speak. And so there was a young man who converted to the church, and he was interrogating the guy about his conviction. Why do you want to be a Christian? What it is that brought you in? And he's capturing the dialogue, and the young man is speaking in Kolokwa. He writes it. Then when he has a conversation with a young man who works with him on the newspaper, he uses Kolokwa. Then another time, he's speaking about the judicial system. And he said, maybe the language that we're using, instead of Latin, as a male trained as a lawyer yourself, but you didn't pursue the profession you're born for you to undertake. He said, what is the value of all this Latin in the court? Mandamus. Nobody can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
We should use the words that the local people understand. Then we said, well, why didn't many do more? I think he did enough.
So, do you think he helped create systems that later contributed to inequality, or if so, to what extent?
Well, inequality is a relative concept, right? So to answer the question fairly and accurately, I say we must ask ourselves, what was the nature of the societies that existed at the time Teage was working?
Mm-hmm.
Were these societies neighboring or outside or beyond? Did they display equality? And my argument would be that most did not. They were highly unequal. And so, relative to those, Teage argued for and helped to forge a society based on greater equality. And that's why when people were kidnapped and about to be sold, and they had a chance to flee, they would come to Monrovia or go to Buchanan or some where they thought they would be protected. They would not be subjected to enslavement. And there are many other forms of equality that resulted from this process. The convention delegates who wrote the Declaration of Liberian Independence and the Constitution, some of them were enslaved people formerly. Some were free. You understand? The voters were not saying, oh, if you're formerly enslaved, you shouldn't be a part of this effort. So that's a form of equality that's being created in this context.
So how do you think historians should evaluate Hilary Teage's record on indigenous relations?
How do I think they should, or how do I think they do?
Both.
I don't think historians generally actually evaluate Teage's contribution. As a child growing up in Liberia, I was exposed to Teage as a guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? And that was pretty much it. And I think for most historians, that has been the main contribution they are aware of and that they talk about. However, at some point when I was working on the book, I saw on the web a site created by some American historians who said Teage was an alcoholic who failed at everything he tried. Yeah. And he said this on the basis of one claim made by one missionary who, when he was in Liberia, had a falling out with Teage. He said it, so that was good enough for them to go and demean this man. The fortunate thing is, after the book came out, they took that down. And they offered a much more holistic and positive assessment of Teage. And I would say then that the record of historians has been mostly of neglect, but in a couple of cases, like the one I cited, also denigrative of his contribution. And I think, from what I've seen, if you ask me what historians should do, I think they need to apologize. If you have someone of this quality, these accomplishments, who's been ignored, yeah, you really need to ask yourself, how come?
Maybe even look at him with greater nuance.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what do you think Teage would think about Liberia's current efforts toward national reconciliation? Bringing you straight back to the modern day now.
That question made me to pause and to weigh for a while. I would say he would probably say that it is hollow.
It is what?
Hollow.
Okay.
First, the constitutional protection for communal lands that was placed in the Constitution of 1847 is being stripped. So we had a situation where communal lands across the country, for the most part, were intact. The war comes, people are driven from their home bases. Some flee to Monrovia, millions. Some go to neighboring countries. Those who can, they go to Australia, whatever. That means now that the heirs to those inheritance are not there. And the war ends, and what happens? Concessions are being granted access to hectares of land for mining, for growing palm, right? Oil palm. You follow me? So what could have been a temporary loss of land is now becoming permanent.
Mm.
And people say, oh, we're doing land reform. In what way? I mean, why are you reforming, and in what direction are you going?
Mm.
Well, the direction seems more and more to be towards those large-scale concessions. Contrast that approach to what happened in Rwanda after the war, the genocide. It's systematic effort by the government to return people to their home areas. And in order to make it work, to systematic effort to reconcile those communities that have been estranged so that they would actually be able to live in peace next to each other.
So let's look at Teage through the eyes of his contemporaries, people like T.J. Roberts. What was the relationship, if any, between Hilary Teage and Joseph Jenkins Roberts? Not only J.J. Roberts, but amongst Teage's peers in general at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the relationship was symbiotic. You know, what you had here was a team of people working together. And this comes from the realization that, we're either going to hang together or we're going to hang apart. Life depends on this. And recognizing each other's strength. You're good at this, you go forward. Teage never ran to be president. I never saw any time where people say, oh, let's put Mr. Teage on the ballot. He ran successfully and was elected to the Senate.
Yes.
But less than a year after his election, J.J. Roberts, who was president, says, Teage, we need you in the cabinet. Come. We need that mind.
And that's when he became Secretary of State?
He became Secretary of State. He served as Attorney General.
Yeah.
During the colonial period, he had collected the first compilation of laws and published it, printed it. And then after independence, he collects again this laws for publication. So on the basis of those efforts, he becomes Attorney General at one point. But as Secretary of State, he helped Liberia to gain recognition from the powers of the day. You're talking about two rival superpowers, the United Kingdom and France. They have been at each other's throats for centuries, fighting. Then it gets in an awkward peace. Then it go back again to fight it. And this little thing called Liberia, this experiment launches. And now people have to go and tell the two superpowers, here's what we're about. And we're asking both of y'all to recognize us and respect our limits and our rights. So Roberts calls him and says, my man, we need you. The original treaty of amity and friendship between France and Liberia was signed on a French ship parked off the coast of Monrovia. And Teage rowed out, went on the ship. The French emissary was there from the foreign ministry. And he signed for France and Teage signed for Liberia. So his interaction with those diplomats suggests to me that he respected me enough that, they will negotiate with him. And I would say Roberts respected him enough to lure him from the Senate into the cabinet.
Wow.
But it's not just the action of Roberts. When Teage died, what Roberts had to say, as a eulogy for this man.
What did Roberts say when Teage died?
No, just recognize the fact that he was a man of immense intellect and prodigious, talents, and the nation must be thankful that he placed those at the benefit of the country.
So he seemed to have done a lot of things and done them well. Pastor, journalist, attorney general, lawyer, secretary of state, humanitarian. Did he have the source, again, for lack of a better word, was he considered charismatic in his time, or was he just a guy who was very, very smart and did a lot of things well? Was he also charismatic?
I didn't see anyone who used the word charismatic to apply to him. But I would say he must have been, based on my understanding of charisma. Imagine yourself living in this community, 13 towns, people coming from different backgrounds. Let's take the repatriates alone, right? First, as a group. This is an abstraction to say that there's a repatriate community. No. What you had were people who came from New York. They never met people from Virginia before. There was no TV that I could watch and say, oh, the how the people in Virginia are living, the how they talk. Nothing. So they come from Massachusetts, from all these different places in the U.S., and they're meeting up with each other for the first time in Liberia. And they have to forge a community. Then, simultaneously, people from the Congo, from Nigeria, Yoruba, some Igbo, are coming, brought to Liberia. They don't speak English. They've never been to America. They're not Christian. You have to forge connections with them. At the same time, you're forging connections with indigenous Africans. So now this is happening, and it's fragile, this connection. And in the midst of that, you say to these people, folks, let's declare our independence. And you're preaching this gospel in the Herald newspaper, and you're giving speeches to motivate folks, and you're writing poems to motivate them, inspire them. And they actually follow your recommendation. I think he must have been charismatic.
Mm-hmm. So was he, let's leave from charisma and look at style now. Was he sort of a consensus builder, or was he a forceful visionary? And if so, and in that arena of diverse peoples, how did he handle criticism and political opposition? Did he crush it, or did he build consensus around his ideas?
I think he was both. I think consensus building and being a visionary are not incompatible. And in fact, in some ways, I think you're required to have one. Now, there are visionaries who fail, and that happens sometimes, not because they're not consensus builder, but maybe the vision is being presented too early. Or too late. The timing is wrong. You're living at in a different era, right? And your vision might come to be down the road.
Mm-hmm.
But he happened to have been alive, offering a vision at the right moment, and he was able to build a consensus for it to become a reality. And on the basis of his call, right, people responded. One of the first instances of this consensus building was that earlier on, you had separate colonization societies in the U.S., Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, creating settlement on their own. Mississippi, East Sinai.
Correct.
Yeah, Maryland County. And each one operating on his own because the colonization society were jealous of each other. They didn't trust the ACS, blah, blah, blah. Teage proposed the idea that this is not working and it's not going to last. We need a commonwealth as the political structure. And he sold it to the community and to the ACS. So the commonwealth created. It's not like you're giving up the power of the settlement that you had, but there needs to be this umbrella. So Buchanan was the first governor of the umbrella of the Commonwealth. And then the Commonwealth is formed and is working. Then he takes it to the next level and said, we need to declare independence.
Public.
Yeah. So I think he was both.
Yeah.
He was way ahead of his time in a sense, or in regards to sovereignty for Liberia. And I say it maybe not in a temporal way, but regarding where the rest of the population was, because people definitely contested the idea. The people are skeptical. If we take that step, who will be able to protect us? Why are we breaking our ties with the American colonization society? And he had to argue in the paper, step by step, why this made sense.
So clearly he's successful locally. And earlier you cited the instance in which he went onto the ship to sign that treaty with France. Let's look at his international reputation. How did or how should non-Liberians view Teage?
Before I go there, there's this tension between building consensus and being a visionary that I want to acknowledge.
Please.
And it's implied in your question, and I wasn't being dismissive that there was tension, because there is. And it becomes evident when Teage published a poem. The title of it is Making Bread from Brain.
Making
When I saw
bread
that title,
from brain. That's a good title.
I was intrigued, but I was also thrown off. And then I read it. And he wrote this 6 months before independence was declared in 1847. And it tells you the story of someone who's a visionary, but he's lonely. He said, where he nameless stone is raised, where the patriots' bones were placed, lived he, once loved and praised, died he little mourned and graced. There he sleeps, who knew no rest, there unblessed by those he blessed. There he starved, the worms now feed, hard the labor, small the gain, is in making bread from brain.
Man.
It is prophetic, I believe, that this man, contemplating his death, he had some attack that he wrote about in the paper. It might have been a heart attack. I asked the doctor, who said that it could have been, but someone in the house heard him fall, and then they were calling to him. Eventually, he was revived, but he described his disability and all of that during that period, right? So he's contemplating his death. And as he predicted, you who work for this thing, when it's done, and the other people come, and they don't name a building after you. They don't name a street after you. They acknowledge you superficially. Making bread from bread.
Brain. And I'm going to do something unusual here now. I know I should insist that you come to the international reputation question, but I'm going to skip that, put that on the back burner for a little bit. And
Okay.
then, because I don't want to end on how he comes to an end. Let's talk about his death and his ending here, and then come back to the international reputation question. Tell us about his demise and how did he come to an end? How did he pass away?
Oh, he died just suddenly. Yeah. And so when he dies, there are all these eulogies and appreciations appear in print and elsewhere, and they indicate the regard that people had for him. The shock reverberated across. Yeah, but he faced criticisms, he faced opposition, many different ways. Most of the time, he took it in stride.
Yeah.
And he would write lengthy analyses that were intended to convince people why his policy was right. And you explain, give the arguments and stuff.
Okay.
But there were a few instances where he simply mocked his critic. At one time, when the elections were announced, right? The first election for the legislature, etc., and the candidates came forward. And he said, I think there should be a test for who is eligible to run. He said, at least the man should know whether Siberia is in Australia, etc., right? He said, because some of the people who come here forward, I don't know that they are equipped to conduct the business that is required. He wasn't talking about indigenous Liberians. You're talking about a friend who in Monrovia and elsewhere who put themselves forward in that regard. So there were times when he handled these issues, with mockery. There was a Methodist missionary who got into a back and forth with Teage. The Methodists had a newspaper of their own, and Teage had the Herald. Someone had posted on the street of Monrovia a note, a claim that this missionary was engaged in what they call sexual dalliance. But they didn't name it. They were not specific. So Teage said in the Herald, as a missionary, that man should respond to the note. You can't just ignore it. This is a serious claim against a man of God. What do you have to say? So the men are responding to the accusation, but they have an assembly, the Methodist Church, of people who come forward to praise him. And Teage writes an article about this assembly. And he said, and so the people stepped forward and they beslobbered him with praise. Beslobbered, you're spitting praises on him, right? He's washing in the saliva of the praise. He said, but when that was not enough, the missionary steps forward to beslobber himself.
Wow.
Within weeks, the man got on the ship and he left.
Couldn't deal with it anymore. But let's come back to that international reputation question about how non-Liberians, how did they view and how should they view Hilary Teage now in the context of our history, Liberian history, African history, Pan-African history, world history?
Yep. So clearly, on an international level, Teage was respected. Clearly, the diplomats who were interacting with him regarding Liberia's sovereignty and so forth, and they were able to protect, he was able to protect the sovereignty of Liberia during that period. It could have been taken off the map. It didn't happen. They respected him. There was a African-American abolitionist who read a speech that Teage had given in Monrovia. He said he thought, he didn't know the person, he thought it must have been written by someone who graduated from a college in the east of the United States, who should be like Harvard and that part of the country. When he found out it was Teage, he published it in a book. The purpose of the book was to say, the society claims that blacks lack intelligence. Look at this. It was called Refuting Calumny, Lies, libel. And here's the example. When Teage died, a white Quaker, Benjamin Coates, who lived in the Pennsylvania area, he said, this was a superior man of greater ability than any black man in America. When he died, an obituary was published in the newspaper of Frederick Douglass, who was fighting for equality in the States, right? And people who took that approach are often represented as having been opposed to those who left. But there's a common purpose here. And he recognized, teaching equality. Thirdly, I think he was just as much appreciated, from the obituaries that were published as well. People it was clear that people loved him so much.
So, are there any myths or misunderstandings that historians should correct, or that you are the one here that you would like to correct?
Before I go there, I want to put a little meat on the claim that people really respected this man. I don't want people to take my opinion, but to hear what they were saying. There was a commentator who wrote in the Liberia Herald announcing Teage's death. He said Teage was the chiefest luminary in our political style. That through him, quote, the melancholy spirit of every Liberian was raised from deep despair to hope. The other evidence I give you is that, Teage wrote the first national anthem for Liberia. Wake every tuneful string. But it was sort of a slow kind of hymn. But he's saying, wherever people are in Africa, wake the strings, play the music. Finally, we are free.
A wake-up call, so to speak.
Wake up, everybody. No more sleeping in bed. Okay, so Teage writes this kind of hymn, and it's a wake-up call. And he writes it a month after the Declaration of Independence. He's inspired. And it functions as our national anthem until late 1800s, later in the 1800s. Daniel B. Warner writes an alternative right, and there's a new immigrant to Liberia, talented, renowned musician who emigrates, Lucas. And he writes something that's more martial, Yeah. And at that time, national anthems of Marshall. So the two of them together composed this new anthem. But here's the thing. Teage's lyrics include repeatedly the line, "All hail Liberia," and Warner, who was like a mentee of Teage, brings the line into, it becomes,
New anthem.
of course, the title of the new national anthem.
The title and opening line.
Yeah, they say that, imitation is the best form of flattery, right? So that tells you how respected this man was. Yeah.
And so what aspects of Teage's personality that would surprise modern Liberian audiences today?
I would say the aspect of his personality that might surprise people, and it certainly surprised me, was his sense of humor. And I would like to share a passage, if I may, with the audience. I hope I can very quickly.
Sure.
But I was researching Teage when I came across this, and this was enough to convince me that, yeah, I need to do a book about him. Not quite. 214 on page 214. Yes. So in the Liberia Herald, March 17, 1942, Teage writes, in an American paper of the late date, we find, quote, Mr. Teage died at Sierra Leone on the 13th of August last, end quote. We admit that we are sometimes loud of notoriety, but we are not dead yet. Although much exhausted from depletion, it rests with our subscribers to revive us by timely application of their arrears. I'm not dead, but I'm dying because you're not paying the bill. I read it and I was like, man, I like this guy.
You can see how, serious as well as humorous and
Yeah.
self-deprecating humor in some instances.
That's right.
But do you think he really understood how important he would become historically?
I think that's an interesting question, and forgive me if I'm a little, kind of two-sided about it, but I think he understood the role that he played, the historic role that he played.
Mm-hmm.
He was conscious of it. He carried it like a weight, And, in that one passage I just read, you talk about being depleted. And there were times when it was clear that he was just exhausted. So he was aware of the significant role that he was playing, but I don't know that he could ever have understood fully the fact that Liberians would later on not appreciate what he had done. One of President Tubman's daughters read the book on Teage. She loved history. And when I was in Liberia, we had a conversation. She told me, my dad used to speak highly of Hilary Teage all the time. And she said, as a child, I didn't know why he kept mentioning this man. But then I saw your book and I was like, oh, yeah. So there were Liberians who knew and understood and appreciated his role, but they didn't do anything to acknowledge it. Tubman was responsible, I would argue, for creating a sort of mythology of Liberia's history as being driven by president. So when you look at Sinkhall, which was laid out during his time, the streets are all named for presidents, Warner, Payne Avenue, etc. And Today, you find that Liberians are collecting and publishing the speeches of the presidents. They are, writing biographies of the president. But J.J. Rowell would have been the first to say that without Teage, Liberia would not have existed. And I don't know that Liberians appreciate the fact that there are people other than presidents who have made that country what it is.
I'm going to tell you that I want your answer to this question to be one sentence. If you had to describe how his contemporaries viewed him in one sentence, how would his contemporaries view Hilary Teage?
Extraordinary. The architect of Liberia's independence.
Wow. Well, let's end it right there. Dr. Carl Patrick Burrowes, Liberia's leading historian and author of 2 books on the architect of Liberia's independence, Hilary Teage, from Virginia, Slave to African Statesman, and the other book is Black Christian Republicanism, The Writings of Hilary Teage. Dr. Burrowes, once again, a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Octavius. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for affording me the opportunity to get this really important story out to the public about this extraordinary man. Thanks.
Thanks for staying with us till the end of the video. I've got 6 questions for you. And if you send the correct answer to hilaryteage@mac.com, you will receive a very good prize from Dr. Burrowes, a book from him. Here's the first question. Who wrote Liberia's first national anthem? Question number 2. How old was Hilary Teage when he co-founded Providence Baptist Church? Question number 3. What was the most important document written by Hilary Teage? Question number 4. How many towns were in Liberia when the country declared its independence in 1847? And question number 5, just before coming to Liberia, what town did Hilary Teage live in? Where did Hilary Teage live before coming to Liberia? Question number 6, excluding the children that Teage and his wife adopted, how many children of their own, how many biological children did they have? Send all your answers to hilaryteage@mac.com, hilaryteage@mac.com. The first correct answer to each question will receive a prize. So we have 6 prizes going out to winners. Thanks for being with us.